All right, and welcome back. So if you remember last time, I ran out of steam before getting to the early Maya stuff. So before we get to the classic Maya, we gotta talk a little bit about some of these pre-classic sites. Most of the Mayan pre-classic sites happen here in the Petén region in what is Guatemala. This is what we call the southern lowlands. This is this basin. This is also the site of many of the classic sites, such as Piedrinagris, Yaxchilan, El Peru, Tikal, etc. But we also have a number of sites here that kind of reach their peak somewhere around the year 100, 300 BC and died out before the classic period, sometime around 100 to 300 CE. And we have a number of these sites. So we're going to take a look at two of them in particular, Nakbe and Il Mirador. These seem to be two related sites. At this point, we don't have any real evidence of writing. We have glyphs, but these are logograms. These are just kind of place names. A place name is a toponym. It's a glyph that means a sign. Represents a city, but we don't have any kind of complicated long inscriptions, at least not at these two sites yet. The two sites, though, are very, very sophisticated. It shows that right off the bat, we have large, complex platforms, pyramids. These pyramids are connected by causeways. These are called sakbe. These, long. The sakbe, I think, means white road. They're these long, raised roads because, of course, the jungle is kind of swampy, and so you raise the roads up above. And these connect sacred centers. Now, there would have been other towns and villages around this, so again, not truly a city, but a sacred center where lots of villages would come together to create a city for the elites, for their temples and their worships. One of the great things about Mayan archaeology is that a lot of Mayan archaeology actually there's a lot of stuff to see. If you're doing stuff in the Olmec period or other periods, most of it is earthen mounds, and it's very, very hard to pick these out of the landscape. But in these cases, they were using large ashlar masonry blocks to define some of their platforms. And so there's actually quite a bit to see. Most of these would have been covered in white stucco at the time that they were white or red stucco at the time they were created, but it still gives lots of remains that you can divine. One of the things we find at Nakbe is some of the first ball courts. So some of the first simplest low platform ball courts. You can see that it has that characteristic eye shape that we talked about earlier, and two low platforms on either side. And so the development shows that very quickly ball games were a very important part of their society. We also have what appears to be the first kind of reference to the hero twins. Every time we see two figures together, we interpret this as the hero twins. Some scholars like Dr. Austin have said, we're getting a little bit carried away. We're kind of like, that problem with you only have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail and you hit it. That's something like this going on, but I think in this case it's probably accurate. We have a head. Notice one figure is pointing to the head, probably indicating that this is the head of Hunhunupu, first hunter, and that these are his sons, Hunupu and Palenque. So pretty good guess. This, as you can tell in the original, is very fragmentary. I think it was broken up to over 40 shapes, which indicate that it was broken in antiquity. When these societies go down, they don't go down easy, and there's a lot of evidence that when they collapse, the icons and the stelae just get destroyed, which suggests that there's some kind of upheaval. We'll talk more about that when we get to the classic period. So Nakbe is very big, but Mirador is larger. El Mirador is probably the largest of all these pre-classic Maya sites. An absolute incredible, massive array of platforms connected by causeways. The Ladonta Pyramid is probably one of the largest pyramids in the world. Here you can see it is almost entirely consumed by the jungle, but when you get to the part that's been cleared, you can see again made out of all this wonderful limestone masonry. When it was in its heyday, it must have been an absolutely spectacular sight. A colossal pyramid and it would have just been one of several pyramids. So this is the Ladonta Pyramid here. This would have been the main Acropolis, with dozens of pyramids and shrines of these limestone-faced pyramids that would have been covered in a thick layer of stucco. So stucco is made with lime plaster. You get lime plaster by burning limestone. So there's evidence that they would have denuded the entire forest all around to create the wood and the charcoal necessary to burn limestone so they could make this beautiful limestone plaster. Now, while most of it is now gone, remember, every single pyramid in the Mesoamerican world has a pyramid inside it, virtually every single one. And inside those pyramids are perfectly preserved the remains of the previous iterations. And so here we have some beautifully preserved stucco decoration. We have in the upper register what appears to be a serpent with bird deities, and in the lower register we have that kind of characteristic sky banding we remember all the way back from the Olmec period, and in between this we have what some people have called, again, a reference to the hero twins, but we're not so certain. Stephen Houston has argued that these are not the hero twins, that they're actually swimmers, which would make sense because this is next to a catchment basin. So this is a place where rainwater would be collected so that it could be used for all kinds of purposes. And so since this was water related, that makes sense that you would have swimmers in there. Perhaps there's swimmers in the underworld. Again, the water almost always represents this barrier going to the underworld. So that's kind of giving a description of what's happening at this location. Perhaps one of the most interesting discoveries is going to be San Bartolo. San Bartolo was another one of these recent finds, and yet it remains an amazing site. It is a massive pyramid, and again it has a series of pyramids contained inside of it. The original pyramid had a structure right in front of it that was covered by the later pyramid. But we were able to tunnel into that and see that the walls were covered with this beautiful mural. The mural had very vibrant paintings. The paintings have a more calligraphic style than later Mayan styles. Later Mayan styles seem more naturalistic, more very closely patterned off of human anatomy. These, again, are more calligraphic, but they kind of look like Olmec styles. We have two massive murals, one mural on the north wall, another partially intact mural on the west wall. And there were obviously two other murals that did not survive. But we have this beautiful calligraphic line, bright yellows and reds. As far as the subject matter of this mural, it's a bit mysterious. There are a lot of different interpretations. For this mural on the north wall, almost everybody seems to think this is a presentation to the maize god. So over here on this side, we have the scene that's below. We have a Calabash Gourd. Notice that the Calabash Gourd always has this very distinctive shape on the gourd itself. It itself is treated almost like a logogram, like a glyph. And we have 5 infants. Well, not 5 infants, maybe 4 infants and then something else. And they are being born in blood out of this Calabash Gourd. Remember, the Calabash Gourd is the tree that was supposed to be the tree that the hero twins' father's head was on, like a skull. And so there are images of renewal and rebirth. The umbilical cords give a strong sense of that. We then move to the next scene. And in the next scene, we seem to have again, a slightly different scene. We have a cave. The cave itself is personified as the mouth of a jaguar. We have a jaguar up top as well as crocodiles. We have underworld characters. And so this figure is emerging from the cave with an offering. This figure, too, is holding an offering of a Calabash Gourd. And this figure here, by his dress, appears to be the maize god. So this god of regeneration. And to his side there are adherents and individuals making offerings and bringing offerings and bundles of offerings. This entire thing comes out on the back of a serpent, as if to indicate this is in the spiritual realm. So a very interesting scene. Notice the Calabash Gourd again, Looks like a glyph. It's really interesting. The next scene is a lot more fragmentary, and this again has been interpreted as some kind of representation of the birth of the cosmos. It relates to Yucatec creation myths, but it also relates to the story of the hero twins. And what we have is a series of sacrifices. So we have a sacrifice of fish separated by a tree. Then we have a sacrifice of a deer and another tree. And then we have a sacrifice of a turkey, and then another tree. So we have a whole series of sacrifices. Oh, and we also have burning flowers being offered, perhaps as incense. And in between this, we have figures of deities, or perhaps kings dressed up as deities. And these deities are piercing their phalluses with stingray spines. Okay? So you can see the blood gushing out, indicating the offering that is being made. So perhaps these are kings dressed up in the role and guise of the original gods who brought forth the creation. And the trees are representations of the world trees that exist. Notice that this tree has the same glyph as the calabash tree, indicating it's a calabash tree. So there's this some kind of linking of all these myths together. Eventually, this leads to a procession of, again, gods who are presenting figures to what appears to be a god enthroned. So there's an investiture kind of ceremony that exists as well. All of this shows that the myth of the Maya are very, very closely tied to the cosmology of the Maya. That is, that the creation myths are reenacted either daily or in terms of festivals to renew the world. We also have at San Bartolo what appear to be the first clear evidence of writing. So we can see these things happening. I don't think anybody's got a translation of this yet, but this is clearly, by the way it's organized, not just random marks. This is a piece of actual writing. So 300 BCE, we have a very formed culture. It's one of the things that's surprising, is the Maya don't just pop out of nowhere. They have this long history. When San Bartolo was discovered, nobody expected that they would find evidence of writing, evidence of complex iconography this early on, but there it is. So from these early beginnings, we kind of have a little mini collapse. Most of these sites have some occupation going into the classical period, but most of them are well past their heyday by the time we hit 300 CE. So 100 to 300 CE, all of these pre-classic Maya sites are more or less abandoned, and we now have a new group of sites that come forward. So let's take a look at a bunch of these. This one is Balumku. Balumku means the Temple of the Jaguar. A lot of these sites, we don't know the original names of the sites. We don't know what they called them, so we name them using conventions, either Spanish or Mayan terms to describe them. And so this one, in fact, does have a jaguar inside of it. So this one is early classic, so we're talking 300 to 600 CE. And inside, again, there was an excavation, and again, because pyramids are built on top of each other, I love how you can see how they've constructed this support of where the later level of the pyramid was. But inside, we have this massive stucco relief and decoration. And it's just incredible. It shows the love and sense of all-over decoration. The Maya never leave anything blank if they can avoid it. It's really kind of hard to interpret. I remember when I first started studying this stuff, I couldn't make heads or tails of it. You really have to have somebody walk you through it to get a sense of it. I think it would have helped if you could have seen it in real life, because the parts would have been differentiated in color. But we can give you a sense of the design sensibilities of the Maya, which is always more is more. Never less is more, but always more is more. This one is called, in fact, the Temple of the Jaguar, because we have a couple jaguars. So here we can see the jaguar. It's a little fragmentary, but you can see his paws. He sits here in between two larger panels, And those two larger panels actually have one of the first demonstrations of something we'll see a lot of in the Mayan world, and that is the Huitz monster, or the Huitz mask. So we have a terrifying mask here, and you can see that it's got its kind of face, and here it has, kind of teeth, a kind of tongue coming out of it, this kind of monstrous mouth down here, and then coming out of either side are serpents. The Huitz mask represents the underworld. The belief was that caves and mountains were places that you could access the underworld, and that the world is very much living. It eats and consumes things. When you kill somebody or somebody dies, you bury them, the earth consumes them. So there's this metaphor of the earth as an all-consuming monster. And so we have here, you can see this a little better in the drawing. Here is the terrifying kind of monster here with serpents. You can see the serpents with their open jaws coming out. Serpent here with its open jaws, serpents here with its open jaws. You can see that these are actually consuming other animals, or animals are coming out of their mouths. Then we have two strange creatures that some have described as crocodiles because they have tails, but some have described as toads. It's really hard to tell the difference sometimes. And you can see that their mouths are open. So hopefully you get a sense of that. So here is the eye, here is the snout, here is the jaw, and then the other jaw is over here, and part of it is broken off. So these are these squatting creatures, a toad and a crocodile perhaps, and their mouths are open, and seated in the mouths are figures of kings or rulers or deities. It's very hard to tell. This king, he himself has a very large ceremonial mask. The mask has a jaguar kind of chin strap mask underneath his head. And so how are we supposed to interpret this? Well, he is being eaten. He is being swallowed up by this figure and is going down. Again, things like crocodiles and toads are liminal animals. They are amphibians. They go into the water. Because they go into the water, that means they can cross over into the underworld, because the underworld is represented by waters as well. And so my favorite interpretation of this is that this is the rising and the setting sun. When you look at this whole thing in length, when we get a sense of it, you have these two figures here, and there's the kind of monster that's eating them, and then the monster mask underneath. That one represents the rising sun, so the sun comes up out of the underworld, and then the other one represents the setting sun, the one being consumed and going down into the underworld. And it gives us this perpetual symbol of birth and rebirth that often exists in Mayan art and archaeology. So we're going to talk a lot about some Mayan sites, and I just want to kind of define the areas. So this is the Petén region right here. This is the area that we call the southern lowlands. This is the highlands up through this region here. And most of our classic sites are going to be in the lowlands. We're going to talk about a few sites down here. We'll also talk about Copan. Copan is the site that is in modern-day Honduras. It's one of the only major sites in Honduras. There's a few in Belize, but mostly we're going to be talking about Guatemala and Mexico. And so there's a number of regions here and a number of really important sites we can talk about, and you can't talk about them all. And I want to point out that not only are there dozens of Mayan sites, and there are literally probably dozens more that we haven't yet discovered. And it shows just how dense this culture was, how incredibly vibrant it was, that we have so many sites. It's an embarrassment of riches. So let's start off, though, talking about Palenque. So Palenque is out here, and this is in modern-day Mexico. So Palenque, there's a couple of things we're going to be talking about. Palenque had a number of very powerful dynasties that existed, but none was more powerful than the one of Lord Pakal, Kanichjanab Pakal. And we're going to talk about him and his son, Chon Balam, quite a bit. It also has one of the best preserved Mayan palaces, and we're also going to take a look at the House of Inscriptions, because that is where we find the tomb and the sarcophagus lid of Lord Pakal. Here is a stucco portrait of Lord Pakal that was found just inside the lid in his sarcophagus. So Palenque is a broad and expansive site, again with many temples. When we look at Mayan sites, it's very common that we will have multiple levels, multiple kind of acropolises and centers of focuses, huge temples, huge platforms that exist. The trees here, again, probably wouldn't have existed in ancient times, but this gives you a sense of what this would have looked like. We're going to start taking a look at the palace here. So the palace itself is, again, treated almost like a temple. Remember that the king and the priests are of the same class. He is the priest in many cases to these cults, and so he does deserve a kind of special place all his own. The palace has a series of porticos and courtyards. It has also this elaborate tower. So when we look at the plan here, you can see open patios and courtyards lined by halls. Again, remember, this is a very warm, hot country. And so then if you, have shade and open porticos, that's enough. You don't really need, a closed-off room. But there are also substantial there are baths, there are sweat baths. Palenque is famous for having a really incredible waterworks system, that they really understood the hydraulics there, and they had incredible, indoor plumbing, sweat baths and heated baths as well. This is what this looked like when it was first discovered, so in a state of terrible disrepair. But again, as is the policy in Mexico, they restored it, partially to preserve it, to make sure it doesn't deteriorate any longer, and also partially to access some, tourist dollars. Why not? And so you have these long porticos with piers that have inscriptions on them. And then you have this kind of talud section that often is a zone of decoration. As you come in the main stairway into the main courtyard, this courtyard again has a series of sculptures and reliefs, and the reliefs show nobles, but the nobles are captives. You can see by their gestures, their hands put up, that they are in a state of, I want to say distress, but they are obviously in a state of submission. And so, kind of cool, as you walk into the palace, you have the nobles of all the surrounding cities carved into the foundations. Of course, the location of that is very important. If they're carved into the foundations, that means that they are beneath you. Your palace is literally resting on them. So all of that gives a sense of the importance of that. So here is the palace as it would have looked, in its final construction. All of this, you have to remember, every one of these buildings would have had a massive roof comb, this kind of open work decoration at the top. I need to go to a different pen color. Everything is red. Here we go. That's a little better to see. So we have roof combs, we have large porticos, ceremonial stairways, etc. And then this massive tower. There's a number of other temples around the site. This one is the Temple of the Skull. This one, again, you can see is partially collapsed, but the Temple of the Skull is so named because right here on the base is an actual surviving piece of stucco decoration. And while the rest of the temple has since collapsed, we can see that on this we have this image of a skull. So again, a representation of the afterlife. Temples were regarded as entryways into the afterlife, places that you could access the underworld and also speak to the lords of Xibalba. Remember, this is how the hero twins get their power. They go down into the underworld, they get slaughtered, but they regain life. They too are partially descended from the lords of Xibalba, and so therefore they have that power. So these pyramids, these beautiful massive pyramids, represent in part, again, a kind of living mountain. And at the top, the entrance to the temple is a cave. It's entrance into the underworld. It's kind of a bizarre thing you have to think about. Is one of the things that you should understand in the Mayan universe is up is down. And that is you go up the temple to go to the underworld. But the going through the underworld is also how you access immortality. It's also how you achieve rebirth. We'll see this also in other iconography. So this one is called the Temple of the Cross because inside the temple there is a large series of reliefs. And these reliefs have a cross. This is very difficult to see in this image. It's hard to get a good photograph of this. So here is a drawing. And this is a drawing from Linda Sheila. And this one, in this case, what we have is Lord Pakal himself on this side. And this is his son, or heir, Chon Balam. Okay. Notice that we have in the center another one of these Wheats masks. We have one of these terrifying earth monsters. And then springing out of it, we have the world tree. This is the cross-shaped world tree. At the top of it is a Quetzal bird deity of some type. And then weaving through, I'll use a different color for this, weaving through the cross we have, that's terrible, you can't see that color. Weaving through this we have two serpent heads that weave over and through the cross and behind the cross. And so this is the double-barred serpent head. You have a serpent on either head of this serpent. Now, this cross and tree is the world tree. And the cross world tree represents the skies and the heavens above. Notice that it emerges from the underworld, from the Wheats monster, the mask at it. And the branches of the tree are entwined with this serpent. And so this is, and we have a kind of celestial bird at the top. So this serpent represents the Milky Way. Okay. And so this was, regarded as, the mark of the universe here. The father here is handing over a mark of title. He is handing over a kind of scepter. And the scepter is what imbues him with power. So this probably would have been made by Chon Balam himself. It's possible that this would have been made by Pakal to ensure the investiture of his son. That all of these kings have a very deep-seated interest in ensuring that their sons pass on in their dynasty with them. And so handing over the scepter, all of this is an indication that the world is ordered correctly when the proper ruler is in charge. So, or it could have been created by Chon Balam himself. We see these same concerns when we look to the Temple of Inscriptions. So the Temple of Inscriptions is a series of temples, again built on top of each other, but we believe that this temple, this main temple here, it was added on to later out front, but the main temple here in Pyramid was built probably in one go, and probably built by Lord Pakal himself. And the reason it's called the House of the Inscriptions is that on every one of these piers is a series of inscriptions, and in most cases they're inscriptions showing ancestors. We can't quite identify them, but they're ancestors presenting infants. And we'll see this again in Mayan art, the presenting of the infant. So there's your Lion King moment. Remember Lion King? So Simba gets held up, to all the people. That's a very similar thing. We'll see this. The presentation of the infant and all of the nobles and all of the gods and ancestors recognizing his right to rule. So in this case, the ancestor whose face is badly damaged holds the infant. The infant has an interesting glyph. He has this flaming axe head here, and he has a leg that turns into a serpent. You can see the serpent's mouth out here. That seems to indicate that they're trying to connect him back to Cawill, this lord of storms, and again, this powerful deity that exists. So while we can't quite identify the ancestors of the figures, the best guess is that this is, again, the presentation of Chon Balam. That this is the heir of Chon Balam, or sometimes Kon Balam, is the baby that's being presented as being the future leader. Now, while later periods of building were built out on the front of this thing, the original pyramid seems to have been built to serve as the tomb of Lord Pakal himself. And there was, in fact, a secret passage built into it that went down to a kind of burial chamber. This was filled up with earth in its initial phase, then later re-excavated, and then buried again, which is very puzzling. The expectation is that perhaps, they sealed him up because they didn't want anybody to bother him. He was sealed away, but once he was sealed away, people wanted access to him because this was a dynastic shrine, and then later it was sealed up again. Whatever. When you get down to it, you have this very characteristic corbelled arch. Whenever you see this arch, this is a very characteristic feature of both Mayan and Mesoamerican archaeology. We get down to this just incredible tomb, this massive sarcophagus. Inside was Lord Pakal's body, but on top of it, it has this incredible sarcophagus lid, carved out of a single block of stone. Again, it's a low relief, but it's kind of hard to read, but if we take a look at the drawing, it's a little easier to interpret, and I've also made these little highlighted scenes so you can figure it out. So at the very bottom, again, we have the Wheats monster. We have this thing representing the cave and the underworld. And notice that its jaws are like beetle mandibles, and that's where the imagery comes from, and they are swallowing up Lord Pakal, who is reclining. There's interesting thing here is that no one's quite certain about this gesture of Lord Pakal. Some have suggested that he is falling, and that's why he looks like he is, that he's sinking into the other underworld. Some have suggested this is a fetal position, so it represents a kind of rebirth. Both of those are certainly possible. So he is consumed by the underworld. But again, out of this death comes the world tree. And the world tree has the cosmic serpent up through its branches, indicating, this access route. So the world tree was this axis mundi. It was this route that you got from heaven to the underworld that connected all of the worlds together. And so, again, it's one of these things that's up is down, that you have this kind of strange thing where you must die to be reborn. And he dying and being consumed by the earth, he is in fact being reborn. And then at the top we have this cosmic bird, possibly a rain or maize deity, resting on the top of this cross. Notice the sky banding all the way around, so that tradition is still very, very old. Inside this sarcophagus, Pakal himself was covered with this ornate jade mask, pieced together out of pieces of jade, these large ear gauges and heavy necklace. All of this meant to, again, protect his flesh and carry him into the afterlife. We also have a number of beautiful ceramic pieces that come out of Palenque. These are censer stands, so there would have been a bowl at the top of this that would have held hot coals, and on those hot coals would have been spread copal, this tree resin that comes from the region. And this would have been made as an offering. And what we see here is, again, a series of deities, and each deity is kind of nested within the other, okay? So what we have, at least in, the top, is probably Itzame, this kind of serpent bird, and it represents the top axis of the tree of the world cosmic tree. We have this figure with a cross. This is the Khan cross in his mouth, which again seems to be an access to the underworld. Okay, it represents again this axis mundi, this way of joining in the underworld. So these figures stacked up like this, again, represent this hierarchy of the afterlife. Really kind of neat stuff. But let's move on. We got to go. We got to get to Tikal. So Tikal is again in the Peten region, and it is an early to late classic. This is the one that may have been dominated by Teotihuacan. We have that very, very interesting Stele 31, which mentions Spear Thrower Owl and Smoking Frog, or Fire is Born, however you want to say it, who becomes the ancestors of later dynastic successions. So somewhere in the 4th century, maybe we have a Teotihuacan general who comes down here. Tikal, again, is another one of these massive sites. Unlike some of the other sites that were only discovered in the 1930s or even the 1990s, this one was known very early and was discovered in the 1840s and was a popular site, and you saw lots of individuals who came here, archaeologists. Here is the construction of this site, and you can see it has these huge catch basins and just massive, extensive pyramids and temples. We're going to concentrate on this section here, the Acropolis, because that is the section that's best preserved today and best known. So the Acropolis has, again, 2 pyramids on either side that flank these pyramids here, creating kind of this triadic structure, which is a structure that we see going way, way back in the ancient world. So we see an open courtyard that exists in between. This courtyard is lined with steles and altars. So we have a stele, and then in front of the stele we have an altar that is usually an altar to that figure that the stele represents. So every one of these is dedicated to a different king or a different member of this dynasty that came through. All of them show the kings in their finery, just usually decked out to the extreme, these enormous headdresses and often back fans and other elaborate features. Perhaps one of the most famous one is going to be Siwaj Chang Cawill II, Stormy Sky, and this is the one that has the inscription which ties him back to that character Spear Thrower Owl. When we look at these figures, though, you'll notice that on this shield draped on the arm of this figure, and in his headdress, we see the image of Tlaloc, and Tlaloc was a deity associated with Teotihuacan. So there are evidence of this cultural exchange that exists, but when we look at Siwaj Chang Cawill here, you can see that his one hand is up. He has this enormous headdress. He's almost completely immersed in all of this, and much of this has reference to his lineage or to his identity. The big character, the one that is going to be the most dominant character at this site, is going to be Jason Chan Cawill. So Jason Chan Cawill is a much later descendant. Instead of coming from this dynasty that comes out of the 4th century, he's in the 7th century. And here in this drawing you can see a little bit better how spectacular a character he is. So he has this elaborate back fan, he has this elaborate headdress of quetzal feathers that exists. Every single feature of this indicates some part of his nobility. He has the Tlaloc motif integrated into his incense bag, as well as this elaborate pectoral. Really quite spectacular. He is the person responsible for the construction of these 2 temples, Temples 1 and Temple 2. They're not the oldest temples on the site. We name temples, based on how we find them, and not necessarily in chronological order. They're named based on how they're investigated. So he is the one that constructs these, and they're almost certainly made as dynastic monuments. Temple 1 was constructed as his mortuary temple, so he was buried underneath it. And inside he was an incredibly rich burial with jades, pearls, shells, jewelry, vessels, and a series of carved bones. And here we can see a sense of what these must have looked like in their prime. This is Temple 1. This would have been his mortuary temple. Unlike a lot of temples on the site, this one doesn't have an earlier temple in it. So this one is just purely a dynastic monument. It would have had this very elaborate, tall roof comb that we see here that is now degraded. Temple 2 is a little bit squatter and has fewer kind of levels, but is still incredibly impressive. It's this massive staircase that exists. Here you can get a sense of the scale of these roof combs. The roof combs are very much like headdresses for the temples. So the temples are, in fact, personified and have their own headdresses. One of the cool features at Tikal is that we actually have some preserved wooden artifacts. So much of the time we do not have the original artifacts because they are made out of ephemeral materials, and only the stone materials survive. So we're really lucky when we get things like stucco and wood. This is carved out of sapodilla wood, which is a very hard, resilient, rot-resistant tropical wood. But more importantly, it survived because it was used as a lintel. So a lintel is the stone piece that goes over the top of a doorway. So this would have been inside a doorway. So you actually have to walk underneath this and look up to see it. Again, it's a little easier to see in a drawing, but this one shows the king Yakinchan Cawill, and he is seated on a litter. So if you'll notice that he is being carried, we have a whole collection of people who are lifting and carrying him in a parade. And then he has arching over him, you can see this arching over him, this elaborate, serpent, again, with this enormous mouth open over here, with this, what appears to be a deity or an ancestor emerging. And he himself is dressed in all his finery, elaborate headdress, etc., and all of this happens underneath the sheltering arms of this cosmic bird deity. So this was a victory. This was a victory parade, him being carried around like a king, and this was meant to commemorate his victory over the city of El Peru in the year 743. This will take us to Kalakmul. So Kalakmul is in Campeche, Mexico. So it's just right across the border from Guatemala, but still in the Petén region. And this is a fascinating site because this was a site that we knew from some degree of inscriptions, but we didn't understand where it was. It was the chief rival to Tikal, and in fact, you have this endless series of battles that exist between Tikal and Kalakmul. And this one was discovered in 1931, so a relatively recent discovery. Here you can see the massive pyramid. This is structure 1, and structure 1 is this colossal pyramid. It must have just been gobsmacking in its heyday. We also have structure 2, and structure 2 has a number of steles. There's steles all over the location. And here we have stele 51. And stele 51, again, this one shows Yuknum to Cawill, erected in 731, and this probably commemorates his ascension. Again, he has this wonderful, elaborate headdress. All of these characters are just encrusted in iconography. They have masks that represent rulers and deities and pectorals and jewels and just endless amounts of cloth wrapped around them, indicating their high status. So this wonderful, beautiful series of reliefs that exist. Had to get a little Kalakmul in there. Well, the next section we're going to be looking at is right along the Usamita River, excuse me. And we're going to be looking at two sites in particular, Piedrinagris, right here, and Yaxchilan. And Yaxchilan is actually in Mexico, and Piedrinagris is in Guatemala, and both of them are just barely inside their respective states. You have this massive bend in the river, and so Yaxchilan is a naturally fortified location in this little pinched off piece of Mexico, and Piedrinagris is right here on the side. Neither of these are very, very easy places to get to today. They're very, very remote, but they have a massive rivalry between each other, and we see this incredible profusion of art coming out of these regions. So let's start with Yaxchilan. Yaxchilan is going to have, again, another massive series of monuments, but we're actually going to concentrate on Monument 23. So Monument 23 is, again, a beautiful little monument, but it is concerned with the dynastic succession, in this case, of a local king, Shield Jaguar II. And here we're going to be looking at these lintels. We've seen these before, but again, these lintels would be overhead as you cross into these temple spaces. And Yaxchilan is noted for these. Most of these were removed by a British expedition, and they're currently in the British Museum. Again, not really taken legally, but, there we go. So here we have the very famous one that we've taken a look at before, but it shows the incredible naturalism of the artists at Yaxchilan. So here we have Shield Jaguar II holding a torch in some kind of ritual over the head of Lady Shuk. Now what's fascinating is all of these lintels 24, 25, and 26, the main focus of them is Lady Shuk. She is the one that is the principal character in them, not Shield Jaguar II, which is fascinating because Shield Jaguar II is the king. You would think that he would be the center stage. So in this case, we believe that this was a dynastic monument that wished to cement his connections to her very powerful family, so that the son would get not just the glory of his father's reign, but also his mother's contribution. So in this ritual, he is either blessing or purifying her by this torch, and she is running a threaded cord through her tongue, and the cord has thorn barbs on it, and she is bleeding down this onto this hun, this bark paper, and the bark paper will then be burned. This one shows her, presents her holding the bowl with bark paper. We have another bowl down here, and a spirit, a serpent representing smoke. A vision serpent comes, and its jaws open wide, and out of the jaws emerges a male character who we're not entirely certain. He's not identified by name. He may be an ancestor to her. Some people have identified him as Shield Jaguar himself, so that may be interesting. But when we look at it, the carving is just exquisite. Here you can see these are symbols representing her blood that has fallen on the bark paper. She holds the bowl. She turns her head up, and we have all this beautiful, intricate carving on her and her clothing. When we look at the ancestor emerging from the vision serpent, you have the mouth of the vision serpent here, curling out, and all of this incredibly fine detailed and cross-hatching on these lintels. This one also shows, again, the importance of Lady Shuk, in that here her husband is being armored. He is wearing this kind of short doublet or jerkin that has been reinforced, indicating that it's armor. The lower half of this is very eroded, but she is handing, and you can see that he has this elaborate kind of feathered train and a helmet that is in the shape of a jaguar, and it too has elaborate feathers coming off of the back of it. So she is handing his helmet to him. So it's really interesting that you see that we have these very, very powerful figures, but the women have a role to play. The women are not, kind of invisible, as we often expect. In fact, in most of these, the women play a very prominent role. Their lines and their family lines are also equally important. And of course, Yaxchilan is probably very famous because it has some of the best preserved roof combs of any in the region. So these are elaborate roof combs. So again, up the river, we see Piedrinagris. So Piedrinagris is another one of these sites. This site is significant in that this was the location that we really began the decipherment of the Mayan code. This was a site that Tatiana Proskoryakov, this very famous Russian-American Mayanologist, went. In fact, she made some of the first reconstructions of any of the Mayan sites. So this is a watercolor by her. And she was the one that first identified these glyphs that indicated the beginning and the ending of dates and reigns on these inscriptions. And so without that, we never would have been able to break these inscriptions into smaller chunks and be able to kind of interpret the stuff in between. So she really was this incredible scholar. And so when she died, she asked for permission to have her ashes interred, and so her ashes are there. So if you go to Piedrinagris, which is not an easy place to go to, everybody kind of goes and makes a pilgrimage to her grave, which is there. Piedrinagris has, again, another really vibrant style. What I love about the Piedrinagris stuff is that they have smaller figures, but more complicated kind of narrative scenes. So here we see a ruler, and in this case the ruler is having, again, warriors presented to him. These are probably vassal state warriors. So these are tributary states that are presenting their warriors, their most nobles, to him. Again, he wears this elaborate shield, this incredible headdress, and this enormous kind of back fan. When are back fans going to make a return in fashion? I swear. I can't be the only guy who wants to walk around in a Quetzal feather headdress and back fan. Get on it, fashion designers. We're tired of the suits. Men need some color. One of the other things that I like about Piedrinagris is that it has some of the most unique stelae and monuments. And every single one of these towns, they're all Mayan, obviously, but they all have their own unique style. It's really incredible. So this is the very famous Stele 14, and this is a stele I've spent many an hour in front of, because the excavations that took place here were actually sponsored by the Penn Museum. So the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, which is located in Philadelphia, which is where I got my graduate degree from Temple, but I spent many an hour over in the University of Pennsylvania Archaeology Museum and in their archives. So this is one that's currently on display there, and it's really quite cool. So this is as it was found in situ, and it has been removed. This one is probably dedicated to Yanal Ak. Actually, it is dedicated to Yanal Ak, and this shows the king seated here, elaborate headdress. He sits under, again, a skull image and a sky band. He sits in an kind of recessed place, which indicates that he is, again, in the Underworld. He is a king. By descending to the Underworld, he ascends. And the inscription on the left-hand side gives us a date for his ascension. This is the day that he came to power in 758 CE. The figure here is really interesting because the figure here is a woman. Notice that she holds a kind of switch, and she stands there and looks up. And this is kind of breaking the fourth wall. There's been an endless debate about who this woman is. It's probably his mother. That makes sense. Again, female lineages are very important, so the male lineage is shown by the man, but you want to show the female side of the family, and so therefore you want to include that. But it's kind of hard interpreting this space. Is she there in the same space that he is in? Or is it, like I believe, I think this is a representation of her in front of this stele. That she is, this becomes a dedicatory monument, so she is looking up to her son in this dedicatory monument in this stele. So there's almost two levels of time and two levels of space here. And it kind of breaks the fourth wall, that you have this monument to the king, and then the figure who is the individual comes away from that. Really beautiful stuff. Piedrinagris has probably the most fabulous collection of altars around. They have a wide variety of beautiful and utterly unique altars that are in a variety of shape. We have altar 1, which is this circular altar, which unfortunately was on this plinth. The plinths have now since been removed. But my favorite is this one, which is altar 4. And altar 4 is in the shape of a jaguar paw. So as you look down on the top of this thing, this upper portion is a jaguar paw. And you can actually see the toes curl around to make the paw. And so not only is it a large jaguar paw, but it is in the shape of the Mayan glyph for jaguar paw. It's literally carved into the shape of a jaguar paw. And it rests on these very large stones that are carved into mask shapes. These masks have these kind of wonderfully, kind of expressive faces and noses. And David Stewart was looking at this, and he was looking at glyphs from the region, and there was a toponym. A toponym is a glyph that represents a location or a place name. And he kept seeing this toponym everywhere for a location somewhere near Piedrinagris that was described in this inscriptions as the place of the paw stone. And he was wondering where this place was, and then it struck him that it's probably this altar, because not only is this upper part of the altar in the shape of a glyph for a jaguar paw, but these lower parts of altars are in the shape of the glyph for tu'un, which means stone, or tu'un means stone. And stone is a common word that often means like place, or location. And so this altar, and here's a view of these were eventually removed, and the jaguar stone is still there, but the lower stones were removed and placed in museums. But this altar is an example of word art. It literally says paw stone. That's what it says, and you can read it. So this part says paw, and this part says stone. And so he says, well, this has got to be it. And so he's probably right. He's probably right that this is the location that is often referenced in other glyphs as the place of the paw stone. It is literally the paw stone, and it is carved in the shape of glyphs that say paw stone. This is like you making an altar out of the letters altar. It's the literal altar is literal. It's crazy. But it's one of the things I love the most about Mayan art is that the scribes had such flexibility in their scripts that they could literally incorporate those scripts into the art to wear something on a mask. And so, oh my gosh, looking at Mayan art, it's like, I don't know if you remember Highlights magazine. Am I really old? I mean, okay, boomer. Highlights magazine was this magazine that on the back of the magazine, it was made for kids, they would have this image search. And so it was this picture, but hidden in the picture were tiny little pictures of things like, a lollipop or a butterfly or whatever, and you had to find them. Well, Mayan art is the ultimate picture search because you can't take anything for granted. If there's some strange little symbol or mask on someone's head or chest or off of their hand, it ceases to be just kind of an kind of artistic license, and it actually becomes a word that can be read. You can literally read their art, and it shows that the boundaries between writing and art are very thin in the Mayan world, and they're masters at this kind of interplay of word and art and glyph. This thing is a three-dimensional piece of word art. It's just brilliant. It's brilliant. I just love stuff like this. I can't get enough of it. Oh, the Mayan world hurts my brain. And you know what? I'm such a noob. I'm such a poser. Come on. I mean, when you look at these things and you look at all the details, there are people who have really struggled to find out what each one of these pieces mean. And I'm just a noob compared to some of the greats. I'm not worthy. But okay, fun stuff. This one was really cool. Piedrinagris is also the site of one of the only examples we have of what a Mayan throne would have looked like. So this would have been attached to the far back wall of the palace. There's several thrones there. And so we have an elevated platform. Again, with these two figures, and I love how this is completely carved out. Again, another example of how there's so many levels. This whole thing here is a mask. You can see the mask. You can see its kind of nose and face there. But then out of the mask are the eyes, but the eyes are rendered as fully figured and three-dimensional heads that are pierced through. Just beautiful sense of design. This thing was discovered smashed and scattered in the region of the palace that it was found, which is pretty good evidence that when the Mayan world ended, it did not end pleasantly. Eric Thompson, one of the first Mayanologists, looked at this and said, you know, this is probably evidence that there was real social strife at work. You know, you don't smash up thrones and scatter the pieces unless you have some really pent-up rage. Let's go to Copan. So Copan is one of the only major sites, Mayan sites, in Honduras. Again, it's another early to late classic site, and it has a series of these dynastic shrines, altars, stelae, and probably the best example of Hieroglyphic Stare and Ball Court. So we're going to be looking at a bunch of these. The Hieroglyphic Stare is over here. Also, we'll take a look at Altar Q, which is over here. This is the Ball Court, but we're mostly going to spend the first part over here in this Grand Courtyard. So here is the Grand Courtyard, and the Grand Courtyard has a number of stelae and altars. Here is the Ball Court right here. So there are many of these altars and stelae. Every stelae represents a person of a particular member of a dynasty, and every one of them has an altar in front of them. This was a site that was visited by Stevens and Frederick Catherwood, who went and wrote about this. These are Frederick Catherwood's beautiful lithographs of the site, and it's really kind of cool because you can go there today and you can see the exact kind of stelae that they were created. Again, the stelae have this incredible richness. There's no such thing as less is more in the Mayan world. It's always more is more. You pile on the decoration here, and then each one of these has an altar. This, of course, has an altar that has an image that looks like a skull, again, a reference to the Underworld, and then we have on the back side of it this other face, this kind of weeds monster, again, the consumer that looks out the other way. Almost all of these steles are dedicated to a single king. There's a number of these steles, but like 10 of them alone are of the same guy. And that guy is Washa Kalun, Klahun, Uba Cawill, which don't ask me to say that more than once, is actually more commonly known as 18 Rabbit. It has a glyph that has the number 18 plus the glyph for the rabbit. And again, these were always known, and they're just beautifully carved, monumental figures that show him in the disposition of a variety of different Mayan gods. So this is Elizabeth Kellerman, who was an early scholar at the site, documenting it here. Here we have another example of this, but I'm only going to really go through one of these because it's really kind of hard to go through them. The iconography is so rich. So this is 18 Rabbit again. And here notice that we have the Wheats monster on top. Notice that it has those beautiful beetle mandibles. These were the things that people were interpreting as elephants back in the 19th century. They're not elephants. But look at the incredible undercutting. So really, there's an amazing level of undercutting to create this very light kind of shell-like exterior to this item. So in artistic quality, these are unparalleled. So the monster here again represents a cave, represents the earth monster. In this case, it's swallowing him. He has an elaborate turban, and he has a shell ornament on his face. But notice that he holds across his chest this kind of bar that has a double-headed serpent on either end, and then this cross form here, which forms out of his loincloth, again is probably a representation to the world tree. So this is a representation of him as Chok. Chok is this counterpoint to Tlaloc. He is a Mayan rain god and a god of lightning and of storms. He's often associated with the evening star. And so what you see him is this incredible costume of, in this case, 18 Rabbit, immersed in all of this incredible iconography that portrays him as Chok. Again, the ruler himself is sacrificed. He's kind of consumed by the underworld, but by doing so, he becomes, the person who rises up through the underworld. Just to the other side of this massive square with all these beautiful stelae is the ball court, which is probably one of the best preserved ball courts in all of the Mayan world. It's the one that almost all the Mayanologists that I know say is the classic shape. I don't know why. They're all different. It's like baseball parks in the United States. They're all different. Which one is the classic? I can't really decide. But just beyond that, under this tarp, is the Hieroglyphic Stare. So the Hieroglyphic Stare was something that was really marveled at first. It records this very long inscription. There is a previous monument here, and this monument was built by Ruler 13, who we think is 18 Rabbit, but not entirely certain. But we think Ruler 13 is 18 Rabbit, and that he built this to commemorate and to tie his connection to Ruler 12, which was his predecessor. So it completely covers the stair. In the centers of the stairs are little kind of representations of rulers and kings. You can see that some of them are missing. As we move up this, you can see that each part of the stair is carved in the name with different glyphs. So you can see the glyphs here are carved right into the faces of the stairs themselves. This has made reconstruction a little difficult because in a few places the stair has collapsed, and this was one of the earliest sites known. And when they reconstructed this, if the glyphs are carved on the blocks and you're not exactly sure where the blocks are and you just put the blocks back, causes all kinds of problems. It's like moving whole words around. It's like, it becomes a disaster. But I think they think they've got it back into the predominant order. You have to remember that, for the first 100 years, Mayan specialists didn't know how to read Mayan. So we weren't quite certain if we were putting some of the damaged parts back correctly, but now that we can read it, it gives us a much better sense of knowing how to put this together. So in the center of this, halfway up this thing, we have a potential portrait, again, of an enthroned king, seated, and again, this elaborate mask that he is emerging from. His head is unfortunately, and his upper body is heavily eroded. So this is the staircase here, and apparently 18 Rabbit built it over the top of an existing edifice that we call the Papagayo, and this edifice was dedicated to Ruler 12, and so in order not to upset the spirits of Ruler 12, he made an even bigger monument. And this is actually a stele of a later ruler that was then placed in front. Just a really astonishing artifact. So one of the other things is that there was one of my favorite Mayan objects was discovered here, and that is the Eccentric Flints. So there was a dedicatory votive deposit buried underneath this, and in those are these absolutely insane flints. Now, if you know anything about flint is this hard, glassy-like stone, and it's very hard to work. You have to flint knap it. It's a very skilled thing. You have to pressure flake off pieces of it as it comes. And you're probably used to seeing things like arrowheads and, obsidian knives. Well, could you imagine flint knapping this? These are just incredible objects of skill. And in all cases, they seem to show profiles and representations. So you have profiles of deities with their headdresses. So it's obvious that, flints and obsidians were very, very valuable materials because they were used in knives and weapons and tools, etc. And so to use this high-quality material to make these incredibly delicate objects, these ornate objects, as votive objects, is really impressive. So if we move over to the other side of the compound, we have Structure 16. And Structure 16 has the location of Altar Q, which is right there. So there it is. And Altar Q is really a remarkable artifact. We've talked about it before, but again, it's this wonderful blending of word art and art together, because we have the 16 rulers that exist, and they start here with the first founder of the dynasty, and they number all the way around to the other side until they get back to the current ruler. And what I love is that they are seated on cushions, and each of these cushions is in the shape of the glyph of their name. So there's no mistaking who they are. So the cushion itself often becomes the glyph. It's really quite cool. One of the other things that's Copan is the Rosalia Temple. The Rosalia Temple is one of the earliest temples on the site, and it's actually contained under, I believe it's Structure 16. So Structure 16, again, like many Mesoamerican structures, is one temple built on top of another, and that looks very similar to what's going on here. But this one was lovingly preserved. We know that they often preserve them, but this one had earth packed into the details of the stucco decoration. And so they intentionally covered this in a layer of earth and plaster to protect it and preserve it before they sealed it in and built the new pyramid on top. So we have this is a reconstruction at Copan in an open-air museum, but it gives us a sense of what this thing would have looked like. And the colors here are, accurate. So you would have had these wonderful masks and stucco features, just really incredibly beautiful stuff. Which brings us to a couple other places that we want to talk about before we close out. And the last we want to talk about is Bonampak. So Bonampak is located right here. It's not far from Yaxchilan and Piedrinagris. It's right along the river here. It's in Mexico. But this was only discovered in 1946. The local natives knew about it, but it was the first time that it was discovered to the outside world. And again, we have a grand plaza, temples, massive Acropolis, but we want to talk about the Temple of the Murals. And so the Temple of the Murals is located up here at the top, and so named for these beautiful murals. In fact, Bonampak that's what the name means in Mayan, is mural or wall painting. And so here we have this rare example of preserved murals. We have to believe that this can't possibly be the only example. There's got to be many more examples, but that we've lost them. And this is also relatively late. The date on this, we have a long count date on here, and it dates to around the year 790. And so that's really late. We're getting towards the tail end of the Classic period, but beautifully preserved. Now they're kind of hard to see because they have a lot of damage. They also have a lot of calcite formation that makes them hard to see. So we're going to look at reproductions for most of this, but just looking at the color, it gives you a sense of the beautiful all-over decoration. But it also should give you a sense of the incredible naturalism of Mayan art. So this is a room it's actually a temple divided into 3 chambers. The chambers have low benches around 3 sides, which makes sense, and then wall painting on all the other sides. So this is chamber 1, chamber 2 is right here, and then we have chamber 3. Chamber 3 is the most damaged and the hardest to kind of interpret. But chamber 1 and chamber 2 are pretty straightforward. They all have this very high-peaked corbelled vault, which is a standard feature. So let's take a look at room number 1. So you would enter room number 1 here, and you have a series of registers. In the upper registers, you have masks of gods and deities, and in the middle register, you have what is believed to be a presentation scene, and at the very bottom, we have a kind of celebration with dancers and performers. So the presentation scene is a scene of a child being presented. Again, like Simba and Lion King, he is being raised on a dais to all of these rulers. Now these are almost certainly ahaus, these are nobles or leaders of vassal states to Bonampak. And you can see they have this elaborate amount of finery. What's fascinating about is they're all different sizes. Some are very heavy set, some tend to be thin. Each one has a unique headdress and decoration. And I love how they are depicted not as just kind of standing around. They're almost always shown in profile, but I love how some hands are extended, some are down, they're lively and dynamic. They are not stiffly posed. And just looking at the child, in fact, they are having a kind of debate amongst themselves whether to accept this child. And this child is probably Chon Muon in this case. The next scene, as we go over, is another kind of presentation. So here we have the presentation. Again, we have people preparing these elaborate back fans and headdresses. And we have an investiture ceremony. They're putting on his bracelets and getting out his jewelry. And this is probably Yezha Chon Muon. And this is the ruler. It is either the child now grown up who has been accepted, or it's him acknowledging his son's right to rule. So the interpretation is that this is the ruler himself saying that his son, who is getting dressed up in all his finery. So this is his quinceanera. This is his coming out party. And all the preparations are being made with jaguar skins and people being dressed. Clothing and cloth is being dyed. All of this is being prepped and for his big coming out day in preparation of his ascension. And finally, in the lower levels, we have a party. So we have musicians with their massive horns, and then we have figures dressed up as various deities in masks, some as crawdads and some as crocodiles and caimans. All of these are characters of the Underworld, Xibalba. So again, you have this performance going on, celebrating this kind of ascension. Room 2, on the other hand, is probably one of the greatest action scenes in all of Mayan art. And this shows probably, again, Chon Muon, but maybe not, maybe an earlier ruler. And we see him in a battle scene. So one entire wall is taken up with this incredible battle scene, and the battle scene spills out onto the shorter walls. We have figures falling and pulling and grabbing hair. Here at the very center, we have the king himself dressed in his finery, with his spear, pulling a person by the hair, and all of these other people. Just look at the overlapping, the dynamic action that's happening. It's hard to believe this kind of dynamism is possible at this age. It's really quite remarkable. I can't think of a contemporary culture anywhere that has this level of naturalism or dynamism in its compositions. Here's a little bit closer kind of reproduction of what this might have looked like. All of these figures gathering. On the next wall, then, we have a subjugation scene where the ruler again is presented in all his finery, and this time the prisoners are below, and the prisoners are being made to submit. And you'll notice that as they look, their fingers are dripping blood, that they are cutting and biting their own fingers to offer blood before the king. The king holds his spear. He has this, again, elaborate headdress with quetzal feathers, this elaborate jade mask on his chest. All of this being presented to him. Here are his nobles, his vassals, and his warriors also offering their allegiance. And here are the prisoners of war. Some of them, this one guy may already be dead, offering their blood as a form of offering to the king in the hopes that he will either spare their lives or allow them to live. Room 3 is also there and has a series of what appears to be elaborate preparations for ceremonies. Not much of it is legible, but what's interesting is that a lot of it hinges around, again, noblewomen. So we have these noblewomen seated on what appears to be a throne or an altar. They carry infants and children, and they too are going through the process of bloodletting. Here she is, piercing her tongue, bleeding out onto bark paper in this brazier. We have what is obviously a kind of scribe or attendant who is recording this. Notice how portly some of the characters are. There's a wide range of body types and forms, and one has to assume that that's just a natural feature of the naturalism that exists. Really beautiful stuff. You gotta love the line and quality of it. Gorgeous stuff. Well, that will pretty much close out the classic period, and then we have a collapse. By the time we hit the 8th century, these Mayan city-states in the southern lowlands are obviously in a state of decline. We don't know why. And by the time we hit the 10th century, the year 900 is a really bad year. Maybe not that specific year, but let's just say that the year 900 was like the 2020 of the Mayan world, because things just went bad after that. And so in the year 800, we have all of these really powerful city-states, and then through the 9th century, things are declining, and then by the 10th century, they're all done. All of the sites are abandoned. So within 100 years, all of these major city-states are abandoned, and the evidence is that it didn't go smoothly. We have smashed thrones, smashed steles. These do not happen accidentally unless there's some kind of revolt. So what happened? Well, the question is one that we have no answer for. One of the early popular ones, theories, propositioned by Eric Thompson, was that there was a kind of a loss of faith. There was a societal cohesion. He was a real proponent of the idea that you have a slave or a peasant revolt, that these kings and elites were sacrificing people, and they were not taking care of the peasants, and so you have a peasant revolt, and they overthrow the elites, and the sacred centers, they're just gone. A theory that became very popular in the 90s was the theory of environmental collapse. All of these temples, and they're vast, require thick layers of stucco. Stucco requires limestone to be burned. That requires charcoal. Charcoal means you got to cut down trees. And so they had denuded huge chunks of the landscape. This meant that water now eroded the land. This is topsoil erosion. This is all kinds of problems. And that they really just pushed the environment. The thing is, they were just too successful. There were dozens of these very vibrant city-states, and they were too successful, and they didn't take care of their environment. And so that kind of fits in with our worldview. We are right in the middle of our environmental consciousness, so we were concerned about that. So I think there's been some pushback on that. I think a lot of people now look at it and say, well, some of these cities are still being occupied longer than we realize. And then there's the possibility of there's just a sudden collapse. There was a war, a famine, or a plague. We don't know. But somewhere between the year 900 and 1000, all of this comes to an end. And almost all of the sites in the southern lowlands and all of the sites in the highlands are abandoned completely. There's a few sites that carry on. And then everything moves north. And that begs the question, was there a migration? That is, did people move to the northern lowlands once they kind of, ecologically devastated the southern lowlands? That's a possibility. Who knows? So we come back next time. We're going to talk about what we call the epiclassic, or the post-classic, or the terminal classic. This period between 900 and 1300 CE. We have a complete collapse of the Mayan civilization somewhere around the year 900. And there isn't even anybody to write the history of it. They're just gone. And they just disappear, and the temples are abandoned, and they're never reoccupied. But we do see new temples and new cities being founded to the north, and they have a kind of second golden age, a huge flourishing of culture. But it's not like it was before. It's a very, very different culture. The art is different, the style is different. There seems to be a lot more influence coming from Mexico, coming from the Mexican basin, and it's going to be not nearly as naturalistic or organic, or as what Europeans regarded as kind of high style. So we'll cover that next time, and we'll see you then. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.